discipline is taken from the root word disciple, which means to teach. And so that's really what a good disciplined home is: not rules and regulations and someone with an iron fist, but really a mother, a father that are committed to helping their child understand their emotional life.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast, where we help you lead with integrity at home, at work, and in the community.
I'm Tara Mattson, a licensed marriage and family therapist and executive coach.
And I'm Jeff Mattson, an executive coach and organizational development professional.
And together we bring you 2 decades of experience in leader development and trauma-informed therapy. We are so glad you're here to help you become the leader you would follow. We wanted to bring Jay Stringer back to help us talk about how to develop healthy sexuality in our children. We have a lot of kindred connections with Jay, so we so appreciate his work.
Jay Stringer is a licensed mental health counselor, ordained minister, and speaker on the subject of sexual desire. Jay is the author of an award-winning book, Unwanted: How Sexual Brokenness Reveals Our Way to Healing. Unwanted is based on a multi-year research project on over 3,800 men and women to understand the key drivers of unwanted sexual behavior, be that the use of porn, infidelity, or buying sex. Jay is based in New York City, where he lives with his wife. Jay's based in New York City, where he lives with his wife, Heather, and their 2 children. Hey, Jay, it's really great to have you back on the show.
Sarah and Jeff, thank you so much for having me back on.
It's so good. Well, we have so many things we could talk to you about, but we're going to try to focus in on developing healthy sexuality in our kids. And back when we had you a couple years ago, we were talking about sex addiction and recovery work and how to do that with rooted in grace. But start by telling us a little bit, before we dive into all these topics, about your story and how it shapes your passion and your call to work in this particular area.
For sure. The story that comes initially to mind when you ask just about how did I get here is, I could talk about my parents, which I probably will in just a little bit. But, part of what we're learning from something called epigenetics, which is basically the study of gene expression. They have done studies even with water fleas. And what they do with these water fleas is they put predators into the water with these fleas. And then when the predator is in the water, the next couple generations, water fleas will be born with helmeted heads, essentially. And those heads that are horned and helmeted will continue to exist until the predator is taken out of the water. So that's like one brief study into epigenetics. So whenever I think about my story, I have to be thinking a couple generations up. And so for me, that story would begin with my grandmother, Dorothy. And to make a long story short, I attended my grandfather's funeral one year when I was in grad school and, knew some of the headline stories about his life, knew that he was a Pearl Harbor survivor, one of the first missionaries allowed into Albania. So we knew kind of those good stories about him. But the sadness that I felt at his funeral was that I really didn't know him in his life. And so I'm in grad school, seminary, and I'm like, I need to get to know my family name. And so I took my grandmother out to lunch on her birthday, and I got 3 skeleton keys from the era of her birth year. And I said, Grandma, I called her Nanny, these 3 keys symbolize 3 lunches that I want to take you out to learn more about your life. So I'm thinking this is like a great grandson gift. Most grandmothers would be very pleased with this, but my grandmother was completely horrified. And she looked down at the box, looked back up at me, and then pushed the present back across the table to me, and then said, Jay, there are some stories we just don't tell. There are some doors you just don't open. And that was the last meaningful conversation that I had with my grandmother before she passed away. So, inevitably that question of like, who was Dorothy? What happened to her? And there's still a lot of mystery there, but we know with a decent amount of certainty that she was very likely assaulted at some point in adolescence. And part of what I have always been trying to grapple with is how did my grandmother know to say to evangelical churches, to small groups, that there are just some stories I'm not going to address? And so if you were to ask about my story, well, I come from grandparents who were extremely secretive and had very little language or understanding that their sexual stories, their trauma stories, were central to their spiritual formation. But in so many ways, they had learned to suppress that and not reveal that. So then when it comes to my family growing up, well, they were a product of those, of their parents. So, um, that brings me to my immediate family. And one of the things I remember was my dad was a pastor growing up, and he would often attend to a lot of the crises that were happening in our church. We didn't have a pastoral staff. It was definitely back in the day where you didn't go and see a therapist unless you were like some level of psychosis or severe neurosis. And so if people had an issue, they would always reach out to my dad. And I always remember being a pastor's kid being like, wow, people tell the truth of their life Monday through Saturday. They don't tell the truth about their life on Sunday. And so I know those stories have shaped me as well. Of yes, we see the public persona, the public face of leaders and elders, but when the elder's wife calls on a random Thursday night to say, my husband is having an affair and she's in tears, uh, that begins to kind of shape our own family system. So my dad would go and attend to those matters, but I would have what was referred to as kind of like more of an enmeshed relationship with my mom. And so when my dad would go and, head out to these pastoral duties, I had kind of a sixth sense for the needs that my mom had within our family and some of the pain within their marriage. And that became part of my role in my family and in the breakdown of my family system was to be the good kid, doing a lot of dishes with my mom after meals, running errands, engaging in conversation. So very long way of saying like, yes, many generations of secrecy, silence, judgment, but also a lot of crises that have shaped why I'm doing this work. Because one reading of this is, I've been a therapist from a very early age and, exposed to a lot of the difficulties and the dramas that take place in leaders' homes uh,
Mhm.
from probably way too early. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think many leaders could say the same. You just have spent many years really understanding your story so that you can help others do that. And so, in the stories you chose to share, there's such richness in understanding those patterns, those unspoken rules and expectations, and patterns that we have in our homes that we don't talk about. Some intentionally, and some just because we don't know to, right? And as you were in grad school, as therapists learn, like, oh, we can't talk about this, or we need to talk about this. So you can see that shaping. So thank you for setting that up. It makes
exactly.
a lot of sense when we think about your passion, your call, and helping people understand their sexuality in a very holistic way. And then, particularly as we talk about kids, how do we do that with our children as parents?
Mhm.
Yeah, and so Jay, there's so many ideas about sexuality from the church and in culture. Why don't you start by helping our audience identify, just to kind of define what is healthy sexuality versus unhealthy sexuality?
Yeah, give us a baseline here.
Yeah. So I think there's a number of ways to look at this. And I would say that we would have to go upstream to just even consider like when we say sex, everybody is going to have a particular transference towards what does that mean? Does that mean intercourse? Does that mean just covenant? Does that mean like what do we mean when we talk about sex? And so even from a Christian standpoint, when we work upstream to realize that probably the person who has shaped our Western understanding of sex more than any other person is a theologian by the name of Augustine. And Augustine was brilliant philosopher, theologian, but what we also know is that he struggled immensely with uh, compulsive sexual behavior. And, this is fourth century, so it wasn't internet porn at that time. For him, it was orgies and just desire for affairs. And so in Augustine's trying to grapple with desire, with sex, he developed very severe theologies around sex and sexual brokenness that I would say have been kind of bequeathed to the church. And so oftentimes when we think about sex, I was with one pastor in Texas, and one of the things he said is, he's like, Jay, I don't know why your work has to exist, because if we just kept sex in the fireplace, which is God's covenant of marriage, then, we could control the burn and we wouldn't have to deal with everything else. And he had kind of just made a definition of sex as, it's just marital sex that happens between a man and a woman. But the reality is we are sexual beings from the time that we are in utero. There's never a point that we are not sexual. And so when we think about things that we're exposed to in culture, dynamics that exist within our family of origin that we're drawn to emotionally, I can talk about, some of the ways that my relationship with my mom shaped my sexual life in a way that seems, at least initially, kind of counterintuitive. But messages we receive from culture, abuse, assaults that happen to us, all of that creates a tremendous amount of debris when it comes to understanding sex. So you have church history that's been problematic. You have things like purity culture that have created and incubated a petri dish of shame for people. And then one of the most damaging things within many Christian contexts is a complete lack of education around sex and what is normal, and just an understanding of how people's bodies work. And so I think whenever I approach this topic, I would say, like, we just need to be aware that there is a tremendous amount of noise and debris when we can even begin to talk about sex.
I think that you're setting a really good foundation for people to slow down and to recognize there's so many voices that are playing a role, experiences, unconscious, conscious experiences that have happened to us, covert, overt. And you offered being able to talk a little bit about your own childhood and how that shaped a little bit of your early sexuality. Would you mind giving some examples that maybe helps our listeners think about those maybe the things that aren't as obvious to us as maybe most people think, well, I got sex education in fifth grade, and that's all I really remember. And they're not thinking about all the other things on their sexual timeline.
Yes. Yes. So in the story that I initially shared of my dad attending to pastoral duties and me having more of an enmeshed relationship with my mom, one of the things that did to me was it gave me a sixth sense to anticipate some of the needs and pain points of women throughout my life. And so part of my style of relating to women historically has been, essentially like, tell me where you are in exile, in pain in your relationship, and whether you're married or have a boyfriend. Tell me about some of those places, some of those stories in your life that really formed who you were. And so, I've been born with, a curious, compassionate heart that, was definitely in a way used by my family of origin to kind of help in the breakdown of my parents' marriage. But that also began to affect my sexual fantasies, my way of relating to women later in life. And so what would end up happening is I would use these gifts and these ways of relating to women. But then the moment that I started dating them, I would feel this kind of radical shift take place within me, where I used to be very compassionate and concerned about them. But then, because my family almost never prioritized my need, had an awareness or attunement to my heartache, my trauma, my experiences, I would feel this kind of desire turn into a lot of demands and entitlement on women that I had dated, and certainly with my wife, to kind of be there emotionally for me, to anticipate my needs and what would be convenient to me. And so just that sense of, I had to build a bridge between, why am I struggling with, certain types of pornography? Why am I struggling in this kind of expectation, demand in my marriage and dating relationships? Well, lo and behold, those formative relationships that had shaped my life were playing out. And so that's often what happens when people arrive in therapy or at a crisis is they think that I'm dealing with an extramarital affair or low desire or a porn problem. But in many ways, those sexual problems are something of a clarion call or provide clues to some of the heartache and unresolved stories of people's lives.
And we talk a lot about working with our clients in both disciplines of counseling and coaching and organizational development about the value of looking back. So many leaders in our spheres of influence are saying, well, why?
Yeah, what's
What
the
is
point?
what does the past have to do anything with my present or my future? And of course, as we do, that it's quite a tell. And we tell them that it actually has everything to do with what's going on right now and what could go on in the future. And there's great value in going back to get our baggage down to carrying on size so that we can be more free as God would design us to serve others and to be available to others in healthy ways. I'd love to pivot a little bit here as we think about kids. What are some key principles that parents can live and teach in their homes, Jay, to help kids develop with a healthy sexuality? I mean, preventative here, if we're talking about that, setting kids up for more success than having to inherit so much trauma and do so much work. Maybe how can we help them?
So a couple things come to mind. I think one would just be good parenting often comes down to two principles, the issue of attunement and containment. So attunement is just that ability of for many of us, middle school was a prototype of hell. And so when we had kind of came home from school, just that sense of, did you have a mother, a father, a caregiver that was really attuned to your face of, there was some sadness or anxiety when you left for school. And then, you knew at some point that evening, there was going to be someone that was asking you how your day was and could observe oh, your face seems different now than when you left for school today. So that's really that issue of attunement, but also the ability to offer a level of containment that when some of the difficulties of life begin to build, is your parent strong enough, capable enough to help guide you through some of those difficulties? And that doesn't mean that a parent has to have all the answers, but it does mean that they are very committed to kind of learning as they go and very committed to offering a type of structure to a family system. So there's a psychodynamic theorist by the name of Winnicott. He compared good parenting, no pressure, to kind of Jesus on the cross. And he said what happened with Jesus on the cross is humanity gave the worst violence, the worst scapegoating, all of the enmity, all of the envy, all of its idolatry, and basically unleashed it to Jesus. And Jesus survived the attack and was able to resurrect and was stronger than anything that humanity could throw at him. And what he parallels that to is that's a good parent. Is a good parent is your kid has anxiety, the kid has anger. It's as parents, are we strong enough and mature enough to be able to metabolize their anxiety, their anger, without pathologizing them, without trying to control them, but really helping them to understand their emotional life. And that's really what discipline is all about. Is discipline is taken from the root word disciple, which means to teach. And so that's really what a good disciplined home is, not rules and regulations and someone with an iron fist, but really a mother, a father that are committed to helping their child understand their emotional life and, offer something of a secure base from which they can explore that. So that would be, 30,000 foot view is if you don't have that, you are going to be very policing or very disengaged of your child's sexual development. So we've got to have good, healthy, secure base to work from if we're going to be able to engage questions of sexuality well with our kids.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's obvious to listeners, but I want to make it clear. You are connecting healthy sexuality, both from what you shared in your own story to what you're sharing now, to the ability to be attuned and comforted and cared for in our emotional life. you didn't even talk anything about the sexual biological part. So
Not yet.
anything you want to add to that, just so that that's very clear
Yes.
in terms of our approach to
Yeah.
parenting.
No, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, we've got to have that secure, emotionally attuned connection with our kids so that everything that we say and kind of model after that really matters. So, one of the things that I've heard is that you don't want to have, one 60-minute conversation with your child about sex. So, some of us can remember like our mom or a dad took us out to a special dinner or gave us a James Dobson book or something like that and said, read this. And if you have any questions, ask me, or, some really long, drawn out conversation way, way, way too late. So instead of that 160-minute conversation, try and aim for 61-minute conversations with your kids about sex or even more. So that begins way earlier than you would ever anticipate. And again, this is age appropriate. There's a wisdom, but with our kids, Heather and I would often talk about like their bodies, right? So they knew their body parts. My daughter knew that she had a vulva. My son knew that he had a penis at toddler age. And they would I remember them getting out of baths, and we used to kind of always say good body, and you all have good bodies. And I can remember both my son and my daughter just kind of patting their bellies at very early ages and saying good body, good body, good body. And so that's where it begins, is like, we say that God has authored the human body, and it is good, and it is very good. And so that begins at a very early age. And then, I can remember my son was probably, I think he was about 6 years old, and his first grade teacher, I believe, was pregnant, or maybe it was another teacher in his school was pregnant. And so he had asked, how are just that classic question of how are babies made? And we had done a decent amount of scaffolding in order to kind of get to that conversation. And I remember my wife taking a shot at answering his question. And, we're somewhat professionals at this, and we're struggling with how do we break this down in a way that a 6-year-old can understand. And so then I took a shot at it, and my son at 6 years old interrupted me. And he said, Dad, I think what you're trying to say is that mom's vulva is a violin and your penis is a bow. And then whenever you all get together, you can create music together. And music are like kids. And I was like, just in that
Drop the
moment,
mic.
like, this is better than anything I will have ever thought or written for the rest of my life. And so that's part of what we found in our family is like, as we have these conversations and move through some of the difficulties and, just how hysterical some of these conversations can be, our kids are asking these questions to us. And another person that I don't know who framed it this way, she said, you want to make sure that you become your child's Google or their search engine, because they're either going to find it out from porn or from their middle school peers. And so as we have more and more conversations about anatomy and about sex and cultural components like porn and what else is out there, we really model to our kids that we are a really good source of information. And if they hear a word, if they have a question, come to us. We are a very good search engine. And even if I don't know all the answers, I'll make sure that I have the answer for you in the next 72 hours. So that model has created just a lot of really good conversations with our kids at this point in our home.
Fantastic. I love it. Oh, goodness. So many beautiful things said there. My favorite is the analogy your little 6-year-old at the time came up with. That is just wonderful. But what you're modeling, and I think I just want to over exaggerate here, is the ability to just talk about it in your home as you would talk about healthy eating and what's on the television and going to school and getting this is just what we talk about. And then you use the language good body. Do you have any other key language words that you would encourage parents to use? So I think that's the most common question is people don't know what to say, how to say it. And they're like, give me a book with the script. And, but I think we can give some kind of key languaging that takes out the shame. So I love that good body. And we talk about this in good, that it's good. Throw out a few more, Jay.
Yeah, I mean, every parent is going to have, one or two areas that they're going to feel extremely awkward in, and then one or two areas that they're going to feel somewhat competent or intrigued about. So, I've worked with some clients that have been nurses, and they are like, I can't wait to have, questions about anatomy come, or I can't wait to kind of just talk about how the body works and really begin to express it. So I'm like, yes, start there. But there might be other things with regard to, how do you talk about preparing your kid to experience porn? That if you are a parent struggling with porn, or maybe you know that your marriage has experienced porn, there can be a lot of energy that you put out there to your kid of like, this is bad, don't ever do it. Which then again, from again, epigenetics, the trauma, the difficulties that one couple is dealing with, that energy gets passed down. So it's not a place of curiosity. It's not a place of like discipleship. It's just a place of a lot of suppression. And so, Carl Jung used to say the greatest threat to the life of a child is the unlived life of its mother, or we could also say father. But just that sense of it's really important for parents to work through some of their sexual story. And if they have areas of shame, areas of judgment, areas of confusion, that's going to play out inevitably. And that's not to shame parents or create even more judgment against them, but it's like saying we need to turn towards some of those places of awkwardness and shame that exist within us and do the necessary work to get healthy and fluent there in order to have the conversation. So the other two categories that I would think about for parents would be the notion of being proactive, and then the second would be responsive. So proactive would be, when we are about 13 years of age as a boy, we have about, I think it's like a shot glass of testosterone in our system. By the time we reach the age of 15, that goes up to a pint glass. So massive amounts of testosterone. So, if you have a 12-year-old son, 11-year-old son, you need to be preparing him for his body of like, you're going to go through some massive changes and hair is coming, sexual desire is coming, the desire to kind of be sexual is going to increase. And all of this is, a very natural and normal part of life. And so a lot of times, I've had clients that they would say that something of their sexuality felt like it began to be evil around the age of 14. And when I asked them, what do you mean? It's like, well, I was just having sexual desire and I was wanting to masturbate all the time. And they had never been taught about their bodies and never been taught about testosterone and how that would affect their sexual desire. So sometimes there's a lot of shame just from an absence of education. Or I've worked with a number of clients that when they first got their period, they thought that they were dying because no one had been proactive enough to teach them what was about to come. So that's a very loving thing that parents can do is be as proactive as possible. But then the other side would be to be very responsive. So, you hear about sexting that takes place at a local middle school or high school and the parents are all talking about it, we'll use that opportunity in the car ride home to say, hey, I heard that there's the sexting thing. And instead of just saying, this is immoral, this is outside of God's design of covenant, and this should never happen, and I hope you would never do this or send it, ask them to kind of develop some of their own ethics around it. Like, what do you think about that person that, sent the sex? Like, what do you think he or she is feeling in this exposure? And so really being, responsive to what are they seeing on TV? What have they heard about in school? And really helping them to have conversations and develop their own mind around some of these topics. So that could be like, what do you think about porn and some of the racist depictions that are inherent within porn? Or what do you think about using someone else's body for sexual gain? And they might have their own opinions about some of these things. So respond to what's happening in culture, but also invite them to develop their own mind.
Amen. Amen, Jay. And because you threw the word out, I'm going to take you for a couple more minutes here, if you don't mind. You threw the word out, masturbation. And that is a common question in the sacred confidential spaces, or when somebody, is typing in a Q&A while we're speaking. What do I do about masturbation? There are so many opinions about that. I even have my own opinion, working in sex addiction and sexual betrayal for years and understanding people's storylines. But give us some language around that for that boy who's 13. He's going to be preparing for that pint of testosterone. Um, give parents some language around masturbation today, and then maybe point to some resources that you would recommend if they want to get educated more about this.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that my conversation to each parent and each child would be a little bit different and contextual to each situation. But, part of what we know, even from like sonograms with regard to, pregnancy, is that in many ways, like we're masturbating in the womb. That, you can kind of see what people are doing, what young children are doing in utero, and they are touching themselves. And so a lot of times when we begin to think about masturbation, as some theorists would say that someone is not necessarily thinking about it in a sexual way until 8, 9, 10 years old. And so for some kids, when they first discover their penis, or their vulva, it's a place of comfort. It's a place of like, I've never felt this before and this feels good. And therefore, I want to touch myself. And some parents at that point freak out and they think that they have a hypersexualized kid, or maybe that their kid was going through abuse. And in many ways, it's that the language would be much more, it's self-soothing. It feels good for a number of children. And so I think we have to have a framework that doesn't just kind of project our adult mind and our adult understanding of sin onto a 4 or 5 year old that's like discovering pleasure and goodness. And so again, just how do you work with a kid that, that this is something that is very special. It's not something that we do in a public place. And I know that your body feels good and God made your body to respond in a really good way with your penis and your vulva, but also like not just with our genitals, but also like when I rub your back or I massage your temples, there's a goodness that you feel in that as well. And so I think we want to, from a very early age, bless the goodness of the body, bless that there is self soothing inherent within that. But then, when it comes to an adolescent, sometimes masturbation becomes inevitably woven into things like pornography, which, again, not trying to tell people this is what your ethic should be. I mean, I think as a Christian, I have a lot of opinions about that, but I always think that there's a need for connection, for relationship as we have these conversations. And so then it becomes that question of, are you using someone else for sexual gain in the midst of that? Or are you pairing masturbation with, behavior that might create a lot of difficulties later in your life with affect regulation? Or, if you're using porn in this way to deal with distress and difficulty and relational heartache, when you get married, you're going to end up using either your spouse in a very similar way. So I think it's like that, just that process of raising questions instead of just like creating a militant boundary around it. So I want my children specifically to, I want to disciple them, I want to inform them, but I don't want to create like, you cannot do this, because that inevitably is going to create a level of rebellion and need to pathologize something. So, I always go back to whatever you do, do unto the glory of God. And that's the big test, is like, it is what I am doing and how I'm conducting myself. Is that bringing me greater delight and greater goodness and bringing glory to God? And I think that's a personal ethic, but also a communal ethic. So I know I'm being a little bit vague, but I think we can go into problems where we either pathologize it exclusively, or we just act like it's the most normal thing in the world and let them go do it in their room. I think it's an affect regulation issue of, does your child know how to self-soothe? And sadly, masturbation is much more comforting for a lot of children than their Christian
Mhm.
household. And so if you don't have that attunement and that containment, well, masturbation provides a lot more soothing for the majority of kids than some of the homes and middle schools that they are part of.
Beautifully said, Jay.
And I
Beautifully
love
said.
the way that that you're calling both parents and kids to critical thinking, and especially as Christians with developing an ethic of turning towards and of attunement and containment. Beautiful guardrails, gentle guardrails. The way you presented it here for us to grow in our ability to connect with our kids and to develop healthy sexuality. A biblical sexuality.
One other thing that I wanted to say with regard to that is I wanted to make sure that, take that sexting example, right? Where uh, you obviously as parents would be horrified, mortified if that happened to your child in any way. But I think it's in asking your child, like, what do they think about it? That I think that that's where we can kind of begin to uphold some of the beauty and goodness of, you know, the gospel and Christians' understanding of sex, where it's like, to be married means that we are revealing our whole bodies, but not just our bodies over text. Like, I am committing to my wife legally, relationally, like across every single aspect. So it's not just nakedness within my body, but it's nakedness with my emotions, nakedness with my story. Like every part of my life is revealed in a place that is good. And that's why, mom and dad, we really believe this, is that this is not just like the right thing to do, but this is how God has designed things to flourish. And so I think that's the nuance I'm trying to make within this is let's be responsive, but also in having really good conversations. I think that gives us a lot of privilege to be able to speak about, a Christian sexual ethic that we have
Mm,
formed. So sorry for that
loved
aside.
it.
I just felt like I wanted to make
Oh,
sure
yeah,
that
that was worth wait. That was
we
worth waiting
addressed that
for.
too.
Yeah,
You're really
wonderful.
talking about developing soil and the root system for our kiddos versus trying to come in with a pair of scissors and like
Yeah.
prune them every month of all the things they're exposed to.
Yeah.
We're working
No,
on that
exactly.
root
Creating a
system.
vineyard here.
Yeah.
That's what we're doing, and that takes a lot of time.
No, exactly. In good soil, there's going to be
Yeah.
weeds
Yeah.
to pick in the process, but the point is not, gospel version of Roundup weed spray to just try and get rid of every weed. It's like, no, we're creating good. I love that. We're creating good soil for flourishing to take place. And the focus is not weed management. The focus is building a garden that is beautiful and eventually one that can create life and nourishment to others as well.
Good. Okay. So I know there's people going, how can I find
Yeah.
all this stuff that Jay's doing? So leave us with your resources online where people can find more about you and your books. And then also give us one resource out there that you're pointing people to that you're really, and moms and dads who are trying to raise healthy children with healthy sexuality.
Yep. So I have, if you go to, I have an Instagram page. I think it's J underscore stringer underscore. There's another Jay Stringer that's also an author. He's like a British crime fiction author. So sometimes we get mixed up. So if you go to j-stringer.com, that's my website as well. But on my Instagram page, I have a link in my bio that goes to some sex ed
Great.
resources for parents. So I have a lot of books that I recommend there, the best router system that you can buy as a family. So trying to look at this holistically of what are the conversations that you should have about, sex from a biblical standpoint. What are the things that your kids need to know about sex across the lifespan? And then some things related to just best practices around technology as well. So we're continuing to develop that list, but they can go there. And then if parents are wanting to address their own sexual story, I do a conference every year called the Sexual Attachment Conference with my colleague, Adam Young. And we really invite leaders and individuals to understand their sexual stories so that they are more effective in just leading others into this place as well. So those resources for parents, but then if you're wanting to engage your own sexual story, could be on my book Unwanted or a conference like the Sexual Attachment Conference. And my wife and I are always trying to think through, that might be a workshop, a conference eventually around just how to talk to your kids about sex.
Fantastic. Jay Stringer, you'll definitely want to tap into all his resources. And thank you, Jay. Thank you so much for just saying yes to this calling and being faithful to the things that you are entering in and providing for the world around you.
Thank you both. And thank you for using, just your all's voice and platform to have conversations that we need to be having.
Yeah.
So thank you for courage to
Yeah,
do so.
you're welcome.
You're welcome.
Well, and we are so grateful that you're joining us each week. So pass this on to someone, another parent, even someone who's maybe leading youth right now. This could be an incredible resource. And make sure you tag Jay and tag Tara Mattson and Living Wholehearted. Let us know that you're sharing. But this podcast is meant to be one of those free resources we're providing to everybody in our community as we're all shrinking our integrity gaps between what we preach and how we actually live, rooted in grace. You can check out more at livingwholehearted.com if you are looking for resources for you and your own journey and your own story. And then Courageous Girls, mycourageousgirls.com, which is helping moms and daughters walk together in that attunement and containment, where we're talking about every topic under the sun from age 2nd grade to high school. So you can go check that resource out if you are raising a daughter today.